It might seem like today, you can get almost anywhere on Earth. There are flights to tiny islands in the middle of the Pacific, expedition ships reaching Antarctica, and people living permanently in places thousands of miles from the nearest continent. So I started wondering, what is the most difficult island on Earth to get to? At first, the answer feels obvious. Maybe it's simply the most remote island on the planet. But the hardest island to get to isn't just somewhere far away. It's somewhere that forces you to deal with distance, weather, rough seas, limited transport, and then the final problem, actually getting onto the island itself. Because an island can be only a few miles away and still be almost impossible to reach. It might be forbidden, surrounded by cliffs, covered in ice, actively erupting, or have no safe place for a boat to land at all. And on some islands, successful human landings can be counted on one hand. There are even islands where, as far as we know, no human has ever successfully landed. So the question becomes, what is the most difficult island on Earth to get to? And to answer that question, we have to look at all kinds of examples. And a good place to start would be the islands you simply aren't allowed to visit. One of the strangest examples sits in the Western Pacific, only about 80 kilometers north of Saipan. It's called Farallon de Medinilla, and at first glance, it looks almost too easy for this search. It's less than 3 kilometers long. Saipan has an international airport, and compared with the islands we'll get to later, it isn't particularly remote. The problem is what happens on the island. The island is part of a huge US military training range surrounded by restricted airspace and hazardous waters. And unlike a normal restricted island, this one is still used for live fire exercises. In September 2020, the USS Antietam launched a Tomahawk cruise missile across the Pacific, and the target was the island itself. And this isn't just an old Cold War story. US Navy planning documents published in 2026 still include the island within an active training complex where missiles, rockets, and other live weapons are being used. So technically, one of the first candidates for the hardest island to reach is somewhere you can fly to within sight of, but where approaching at the wrong time could put you inside an active military range. And there are even larger islands where the restriction is almost absolute. Diego Garcia, in the middle of the Indian Ocean, has an airport, roads, buildings, and a major military facility. Yet, for an ordinary traveler, none of that helps. There are no commercial flights. Current rules say access is limited to people connected with the military facility or the territory's administration, and unauthorized vessels aren't even permitted within 3 nautical miles of the island. That creates a strange contradiction. An island can have aircraft landing on it, ships supplying it, and people working there, while being effectively unreachable to almost everyone watching this video. And if you actually tried to approach either of these islands without authorization, the first obstacle probably wouldn't be the ocean. It would be the military. Long before you reach the shore, there is a good chance you would be detected, intercepted, and turned away. But that also exposes the problem with calling them the hardest islands on Earth to get to, because there is a reliable way onto them. Become a soldier, work for one of the authorized organizations, or otherwise receive the right clearance, and suddenly these supposedly unreachable islands have aircraft, ships, and established logistics capable of taking you there. Their difficulty is created by people. If those restrictions disappeared tomorrow, Farallon de Medinilla and Diego Garcia would immediately become much easier to reach. So to get closer to the real answer, we need somewhere where permission changes almost nothing. Somewhere where nobody is stopping you, but the island itself is. To find that, we have to leave the military outpost behind completely. From Diego Garcia, we cross the Indian Ocean, pass Australia, and continue thousands of kilometers into the South Pacific toward the scattered islands of Tonga. Because here, there is an island where the problem isn't who owns it, or whether you have the right permit. The problem is that sometimes, the island itself is still being built. This is Home Reef. Home Reef sits on the Tofua volcanic arc, where most of the volcano is hidden beneath the Pacific. For long periods, there has been almost nothing above the surface at all. Then the volcano erupts. In 1984, an eruption created a new island roughly 1.5 kilometers long. Within months, the ocean had almost completely destroyed it. The same thing happened again in 2006. That time, sailors were among the first people to realize something unusual was happening. The crew of the yacht Macon was sailing through Tonga when they started seeing pumice floating on the water. Then there was more of it. Eventually they sailed into a field of floating volcanic rocks so dense that their yacht slowed from around 7 knots to just 1. They turned around and shortly afterward found something that had not been there before. A smoking volcanic island rising out of the Pacific. The eruption produced enormous pumice rafts that eventually drifted hundreds and even thousands of kilometers across the ocean. And Home Reef still hasn't settled down. The volcano broke above sea level again in 2022, and repeated eruptions since then have kept changing the island. By early 2025, it had grown to more than 12 hectares. Then, activity increased again in December 2025. Lava began adding entirely new sections to the coastline. By February 2026, NASA satellite images showed the island expanding in several directions, while steam, gas, and ash continued rising from the crater. At times, even getting close was considered dangerous. Earlier this year, Tonga Geological Services placed the maritime alert at its highest level and advised ships to remain at least 2 nautical miles, or 3.7 kilometers, away. During February, one warning expanded that distance to 5 nautical miles. At Home Reef, the Pacific and the volcano decide whether there is a safe island to approach in the first place. A coastline visible on satellite imagery one year can be larger the next, partly eroded later, or covered by fresh lava during another eruption. But even Home Reef doesn't quite feel like the answer. People have sailed close enough to photograph eruptions here. Aircraft monitor it. Naval vessels have passed nearby. And when the volcano becomes quiet, the biggest obstacle temporarily disappears. In fact, after March 2026, the eruption weakened significantly, and by July, no new volcanic activity was being detected. So, Home Reef may occasionally become one of the most dangerous islands on Earth to approach, but it isn't consistently one of the hardest to reach. For that, we need somewhere where the obstacle doesn't disappear when the volcano goes quiet. Somewhere where getting there is difficult every single day of the year. To find that, we have to leave the Pacific almost completely behind. From Home Reef, we cross the South Pacific, pass over South America, and continue deep into the South Atlantic, until eventually there is almost nothing left around us. Except one volcanic island. This is Tristan da Cunha. Unlike every island we've looked at so far, people actually live here. There are roads, houses, a school, a hospital, and just over 200 permanent residents. What it does not have is an airport. The nearest mainland city is Cape Town, about 2,810 kilometers, or 1,750 miles away, and the normal journey takes around 6 days by ship, and even that makes it sound easier than it is. In the entire 2026 schedule, there are only 9 planned departures from Cape Town. Most of the ships carry no more than 12 passengers, spaces are booked months in advance, and tourists sit at the very bottom of the priority list. If an islander needs medical evacuation or someone has urgent official business, your place can simply be taken away. Then, after nearly a week at sea, you still haven't necessarily reached Tristan. The island government specifically warns that whether you can actually land depends on the weather. And in May 2026, the world got an extraordinary demonstration of what that isolation really means. A resident became critically ill during the hantavirus outbreak linked to the cruise ship Hondius. Tristan's medical team was running dangerously low on oxygen, and waiting for a ship would take too long. So Britain came up with another solution. They flew a Royal Air Force military airplane thousands of kilometers into the South Atlantic and dropped 6 paratroopers and 2 military clinicians out of the aircraft directly onto the island. One of the doctors had never parachuted before. The team descended through roughly 4,000 feet of cloud and winds of around 20 knots, carrying equipment, medicine, and oxygen. According to the British government, it was the first known parachute insertion onto Tristan da Cunha. They had found a way to get onto the island in an emergency. Getting back off was another matter. You cannot parachute upward. The team had to remain on Tristan until HMS Medway could sail all the way from the Falkland Islands to collect them. And when the ship finally arrived, bad weather initially prevented the transfer anyway. They had to wait offshore until conditions improved. That might be the best demonstration of Tristan's isolation imaginable. And yet Tristan still cannot be our answer. Because difficult as it is, there is a system. Ships reach it every year. Hundreds of people live there permanently. If you plan far enough ahead and the weather cooperates, you can get there. So now we have to remove even that advantage. No settlement, no scheduled ship, no harbor waiting for you. And somewhere much farther north, there is an island where explorers managed to discover it long before they could actually figure out how to stand on it. From Tristan da Cunha, we now travel northeast across Africa and almost the entire length of Russia until we reach the East Siberian Sea. Out here, hundreds of kilometers beyond the Siberian coast, the ocean spends much of the year covered in moving ice. And hidden among it is a tiny island with a strange distinction. The men who discovered it couldn't actually get onto it. This is Jeannette Island. The story begins in 1879 when the USS Jeannette left San Francisco with 33 men attempting to reach the North Pole. The expedition was prepared for years. The ship had been reinforced specifically to survive Arctic ice. It didn't work. Within months, Jeannette became trapped in the pack ice north of Siberia. Instead of sailing, the entire ship simply drifted with the frozen ocean for nearly 2 years. Then, in May 1881, the crew spotted land they had never seen on any map. They named it Jeannette Island, but there was a problem. After spending almost 2 years trapped in the Arctic, they had finally discovered a new island, and the ice still wouldn't allow them to reach it. The crew could only observe it from a distance. A few weeks later, the pressure of the pack ice crushed their ship completely. Jeannette sank about 560 kilometers, or 350 miles, from the Siberian coast, leaving the men dragging boats and supplies across the ice on foot. Only 13 of the original 33 eventually survived, and Jeannette Island remained behind them. And even today, with modern technology, reaching this part of the Arctic still depends on an almost ridiculous combination of conditions. A 2017 international expedition returned to the day-long islands aboard the Russian research vessel Mikhail Somov, carrying rubber boats and a helicopter. They considered themselves lucky. That year, there was unusually little sea ice, allowing the expedition to reach every island in the group. When 4 members finally reached Jeannette, they found 6 polar bears on an island only about 3 square kilometers in area. The expedition even traveled with armed Arctic rangers specifically for polar bear protection, and that makes Jeannette much closer to what we're looking for. Nobody is firing missiles at you. There is no airport, no scheduled ship, and no permanent population waiting at the other end. You can organize an entire Arctic expedition, arrive in exactly the right part of the ocean, and still have the ice fog or swell simply refuse to let you ashore. But Jeannette has been reached. And if we're looking for the hardest island on Earth to get to, there are places where the gap between discovery and the first successful landing wasn't measured in decades. It was more than a century. To find one, we have to leave the Arctic and travel almost to the opposite end of the planet. From the East Siberian Sea, we head south across the Pacific, past New Zealand, and continue into the Southern Ocean toward the Balleny Islands. At the southern end of the chain is Sturge Island. It was discovered by John Balleny in 1839, but unlike nearby islands, nobody is known to have successfully landed on Sturge for more than a century. Expeditions passed it repeatedly. Scott's Terra Nova expedition sailed through the region in 1911. Australian expeditions returned later. The island remained mapped, photographed, and clearly visible, but still physically unreached. The first landing believed to have been made on Sturge finally came in 1965, when an American-New Zealand scientific expedition arrived aboard the U.S. Navy icebreaker Glacier. That was 126 years after the island had been discovered, and the reason becomes obvious when you see it. Sturge is almost completely covered in ice. Much of its coastline is steep and exposed, and the surrounding Balleny Islands can remain trapped in sea ice for most of the year. So, for more than a century, humanity knew exactly where Sturge Island was. We just couldn't reliably get onto it, but eventually someone did, and from here, the numbers become much smaller, because there are islands where known successful landings can be counted on one hand. From Sturge Island, we now travel north through the Southern Ocean toward Macquarie Island, but we're not stopping there. About 33 kilometers beyond its southern coast is a scattering of rocks so small that the main island covers only around 3 hectares. These are the Bishop and Clerk Islets. According to the best documented record, there have been only 3 known human landings here. The first came in 1965, when a scientific expedition approached aboard a ship carrying a helicopter. But even with the helicopter, they didn't actually make it onto Bishop Islet itself. They landed on a wave-washed rock about 50 meters away, stayed for less than an hour, and left. The second attempt came in 1976. This time, a helicopter managed to place researchers directly onto the main islet. Then, 17 years passed before anyone returned. On December 23, 1993, 7 scientists were flown in for what became the first comprehensive biological survey of the island. They had only about 3 hours on the ground, but in that short window they discovered 12 bird species, including what was then identified as Australia's largest known colony of black-browed albatrosses. And then they left. That 1993 visit remains the most recent documented landing in the records I could find. What makes that extraordinary is how close these islands are to a place humans regularly occupy. Macquarie Island, just 33 kilometers away, has hosted an Australian research station since 1948. Scientists have ships, helicopters, and decades of experience operating in these waters. Yet reaching Bishop and Clerk has still been rare enough that the entire documented landing history fits into 3 dates: 1965, 1976, and 1993. At this point, we're getting extremely close to the limit. We started with islands that ordinary people weren't allowed to visit, then islands with no airport, islands blocked by Arctic ice, and one that remained unlanded for 126 years. Here, the number of known landings has fallen to 3, but just on the other side of Macquarie Island is another group of rocks, where that number falls one final time. Not to 2, not to 1, to 0. From Bishop and Clerk, we stay in the Southern Ocean and follow the Macquarie Ridge north, toward one final group of rocks. But before we get there, Bishop and Clerk are not the only islands where the landing record almost disappears completely. Meyer Rock, beside the McDonald Islands, is another possible contender. It is a steep volcanic pinnacle in one of the most isolated parts of the Southern Ocean, and I couldn't find a single confirmed landing on it. I actually covered Meyer Rock in my video about the most impossible islands to reach, which I'll link here if you want to see that story. The problem is that its history is so poorly documented that no confirmed landing is not quite the same as proving nobody has ever landed there. Australia only records 2 landings on nearby McDonald Island, so there are simply huge gaps in the record. For the final candidate, we have something much stronger. These are the Judge and Clerk Islets. They lie in the same violent belt of the Southern Ocean as Macquarie Island, almost 1,500 kilometers southeast of Tasmania. Getting into this region already means crossing an enormous stretch of open ocean where strong winds and heavy seas have challenged ships since the first expeditions came here, but arriving at the coordinates is only the beginning. Judge and Clerk are barely islands at all. They are a collection of low-exposed rocks rising directly from the ocean. Douglas Mawson's expedition sailed around them more than a century ago, describing the main rocks as only about 24 meters, or 80 feet high. His ship Aurora took depth soundings around them, and the expedition produced detailed maps showing their position and even their appearance. So, humans have known exactly where these rocks are for generations. We have sailed around them, measured the water around them, and surveyed them from the air. Yet Australia's official World Heritage nomination contains one extraordinary sentence: there has been no known landing on the Judge and Clerk Islets. And the same document explains why this might be more than coincidence. The rocks are repeatedly washed by waves and heavy spray. An aerial survey found so little vegetation that researchers could identify little more than algae and lichens, and conditions were considered so exposed that even seabirds and marine mammals were thought unlikely to breed there. That is what separates Judge and Clerk from almost everything else in this video. Farallon could be reached if the military let you in. Home Reef becomes approachable when the eruption stops. Tristan has ships. Jeannette can be reached when the ice cooperates. Sturge eventually gave people a landing window. And immediately before this, Bishop and Clerk proved that even these Southern Ocean rocks can sometimes be conquered with a ship and a helicopter. Judge and Clerk are where that progression stops. Of course, no historical record can prove that a human has never touched one of these rocks. And with modern equipment, somebody may eventually do it. But if we judge difficulty by what humans have actually managed to accomplish, there is something remarkable about an island that has been mapped for more than a century, approached with ships, examined from aircraft, and still has no known successful landing. Maybe the hardest island to reach isn't the one that takes the longest journey. Maybe it's the one where you can complete the entire journey and still fail in the final few meters. And if you made it all the way to the end, I have one small favor to ask. These videos take a ridiculous amount of time to research, especially when the final answer depends on digging through old expedition reports, government documents, and islands that almost nobody has ever heard of. So if you enjoyed this one, please leave a like and comment. It genuinely helps YouTube understand that people still want videos about strange corners of the planet that aren't already covered 1,000 times. And if this is your kind of thing, please subscribe. Thanks for watching.